Welcome to the Dairy Farmers Digest, a podcast dedicated to all things dairy farming. Each episode, we will talk to industry leaders who share their insights and experiences into the dairy business. I'm your host, Keith Schweitzer, and I hope you enjoy this episode. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back to the DFD podcast. I'm your host, Keith Schweitzer. Today we have Trent Westhoff, soon to be Dr. Trent Westhoff from Cornell University. So Trent, we were just talking before we got on here, and you're based out at Ithaca, New York. So are you right on campus at Cornell?
Yeah, I am. About 3 miles from campus is where I'm located, but obviously a lot of the work happens there on campus in the College of Veterinary Medicine, and quite a bit of collaboration with the Department of Animal Science as well.
Yeah, and so I was just kind of reading up on you before we got started here. So you're an Iowa farm boy?
Yes, so grew up in Iowa on my family's dairy and swine farm. So we milked about 70 cows in a tie-stall barn, and when I was very young, we had a farrow to finish operation. Has since transitioned that to a wean finish operation, and my brother is coming back into the operation now and expanding that operation as he comes into the business.
Okay, whereabouts in Iowa? Because I hear that's God's country when it comes to farming in the United States.
Yeah, so I'm in the northeast part of the state. So if you take the Wisconsin and the Illinois border and you go 30 minutes west into Iowa, I sit right there in a town called Dyersville.
Okay, nice. So yeah, I have a lot of friends that work for seed companies and stuff, and they ended up in Iowa, working for the big guys, the Pioneers and the DeKalbs. So I kind of want to get into this here. Like, I know you've focused a lot of your study, and if I'm not mistaken, your postgraduate work has been on colostrum.
Correct. Yeah. So I got my undergraduate degree at Iowa State and bachelor's degree. I finished in 2019, and then I came out to New York and started my PhD at Cornell. And the first couple of years of that I was here, we actually looked at the epidemiology of colostrum production, really trying to understand the seasonal variability and the different factors on farm that go into both the quality and the volume that cows produce at calving. So there's a lot of different aspects, and I think that you guys have had these conversations on this podcast already from what I've seen. But we see a lot of factors that affect colostrum production, and some of these factors we're not able to manage on farm, things like parity, breed, that animal is what she is at that point in time. But our interest kind of lies in just better understanding the factors that we can and cannot manage through on farms, just so we can get an understanding of during these fall and winter months when we have periods of low colostrum supply that can be challenging for our colostrum feeding programs. Are there things nutritionally or management wise that we can alter to try to help ourselves come through these tough periods?
I know it's been a question I get posed a lot by primary producers, and it usually starts in late October, early November. Is like, why all of a sudden isn't there any colostrum in the cows? And honestly, like, we probably I started hearing about it maybe 5, 6, 7 years ago. It was a bit more predominant in the industry. And when you start looking into what some of those factors could be, like, there is not a lot of information out there.
Yeah, the literature out there looking at this is pretty slim to date. I think there's obviously some more groups, and it's getting some more attention now. So it is getting looked at now. But when we look at this, we have to remember that we need a lot of animals and a lot of farms to be able to look at these. And a lot of the studies are observational in nature, meaning that we're just looking for associations or factors that are associated with the colostrum supply. And we're not able to say by changing X variable, we're going to get Y response. So now that we're starting to get some of these more observational based understandings of the things that are going on, or factors that we could look into further, now in the research world, we're trying to gain more traction to start looking at things like nutritional factors during the dry period, and do those in a more controlled experimental setting, and be able to look at in that population of animals if we change diet with variable X if we can get that response in colostrum production. So, we have some ideas of things that we should be looking at and can be looking at, but to date, it's very hard to be able to make a change in your nutrition or management and get a consistent response in colostrum production. I think one of those factors that we see come up quite a bit is the length of the dry period. With those animals that have a shorter dry period or being managed for a shorter dry period, shorter meaning 35 to 45 days, you can expect a lower colostrum yield than an animal that's managed for a 60-day dry period. But when it comes to nutrition, we really need more data, and collecting that data is going to take more time before we can make some more practical recommendations that we get consistent responses for.
When we first started hearing about it, I kind of thought, well, is it like here in kind of the Midwest and I guess the eastern seaboard of the US, like we feed a lot of higher fiber, kind of more energy moderate or energy regulated diets. And I wondered if it has something to do with that. But I find it doesn't matter. Like if a producer's going like in a traditional, far off dry cow, close up dry cow, or what they used to call like steam up diets versus a single group TMR for the whole, 55, 60-day dry period, there wasn't a lot of difference. So it kind of, to me, it kind of said that no, probably nutrition might not be the end all be all fix of this. And just like anecdotally on farm, we've tried different things, feed a little bit more protein, feed a little bit more energy just to the close-up cows. And, like the old Ron Burgundy thing, 50% of the time it works every time. Like sometimes you get a response by it and sometimes nothing would change.
I think it's interesting that you see that, and we hear that a lot from the industry. And when we hear these inconsistent responses, that, and to me, tells me that we're always missing a part of it. And we see it always consistently in that fall and winter months. So a lot of our brains go to, well, the seasons are changing, the amount of light's changing, the temperature is changing. There's a few small studies that have looked at the temperature humidity index or the amount of light. And again, we're not getting consistent responses. So I think the next step that we need to take is we need to go more mechanistic, and we need to understand what factors are really controlling that volume in that cow. And then with that knowledge, we're able to maybe make more targeted approaches in order to consistently get a response in yield.
Yeah, is it like with the seasonality change? Like I was always under the understanding, like with a dry cow, you kind of want to have an opposite daylight of a milk cow. Like a milk cow, you kind of want 16 hours of daylight, 8 hours of dark. With the dry cow, you want to be the inverse of it. And the other thing I got thinking about was heat stress. Like, is there something going on in like the last trimester? Like you're drying a cow up in the summer that's going to calve in the fall. Like, is there an influence from there? I wonder.
Yeah, there's a little bit of literature. One study that I find very interesting, where they house cows in they called a cooled group. So those animals are offered shade, fans, and sprinklers. So just very typical cooling mechanisms that we would see on herds. And then they had a group that was heat stressed, and they were doing this in a warmer climate. So those animals had access to shade, but no fans or sprinklers. And then they had a pair-fed control group, which those animals were offered the cooled housing, but fed the same dry matter intake as those heat stressed cows to try to really weed out, is it the lack of dry matter intake due to heat stress, or is it the heat stress? And they saw that those cows that were heat stressed had a lower colostrum yield and IgG concentration, indicating that independent of the nutritional or the drop-in nutrient intake, those animals that were heat stressed had a lower colostrum yield. So when I look at this big picture, I think there's so many different factors, and we're trying to isolate the one factor that, we change one factor and we get the response that we're looking for. But I think we really need to take a step back and probably look at a number of different factors that are affecting it. And when we go across and we look at multiple herds, we see herd effects. So the same factor on one herd that might be affecting the colostrum yield more negatively might not be the same primary factor that we need to focus our attention on in another herd. But obviously that makes it extremely challenging, because we have to be very tailored in our situations and kind of take a look at the the situation that we're in on an individual herd to kind of understand, how do we, or what can we try on this individual herd to hopefully get a response. But when it comes down to the short term, we still have to preserve the colostrum supply for the calf's benefit. So the recommendations that we're making right now are to focus on the things that we can easily manage. We're going to continue to try to work on the cow side to try to get a better understanding and hopefully be able to make some more practical recommendations. But in the short term, we still have to be able to have a consistent colostrum supply so that we're not essentially having the expense of our calf by our lack of preparation. So if we know that these things are consistently coming in the fall and the winter, what are the things that we can be doing in the now as we're in our summer months when our colostrum yield should be at plenty to prepare ourselves for the fall and winter months? And one of those just comes back to storing colostrum. It's easy, especially if you have a freezer. When we get into our summer months, June, July, most farms are not having issues with colostrum production. Store some of that extra high quality colostrum and keep that around. So when you get to October, November, when you are short, you're able to pull from that supply.
Yeah. And we have a lot of producers kind of doing that. And actually in this kind of neck of the woods here in Ontario, we have a lot of producers selling excess colostrum to SCCL. So, and then at the end of the day, they're buying it back and they're supplementing powdered stuff, which has its own expense to it, but the calf still needs it. So, I mean, it's the future of your dairy herd. So I think like exactly what you said, like it pays to plan a little bit and make sure that we've kind of got our bases covered on making sure at the end of the day, this calf gets the adequate amount of nutrients in it in the first day of life.
Right. I think that we're seeing plenty of good research, especially coming out of Guelph there and other Canadian institutions that show that colostrum really is beneficial for these animals. And, we're putting so much investment, not only by selective breeding, but also the cost it's going to take that heifer calf or all calves for that matter to get to their final goal, whether that's entering the milking string or going off to the feedlot. So really focusing on the opportunities that exist within the first 24, 48 hours of that calf when we're specifically looking at colostrum management, I always think is a place that is easy to overlook because it's such a short time period. But in the end of the day, it's such an important component of that calf's life. And we can see those benefits go beyond even the pre-weaning phase. And each one of these illnesses have costs associated with them. And I think that colostrum should always be a part of this story when we talk about not only health of the pre-weaning phase, but additional benefits beyond that.
Well, and it's interesting you mentioned the non-replacement animals too, because with the value that some of these producers are seeing at the farm gate with some of these 10-day-old beef cross calves, like it really pays. You might not see the payback of it, but I know the feedlots will see the payback of it because just like the dairy heifers, it seems the ones that, if you're above that 70-80% of passive, like good or oh, I can't think of the word, but like really good passive transfer, like I understand that there's work being done on looking at these animals through the feedlot and processing phase, and they're seeing the benefits of that too. So
yeah, and just because we're not retaining ownership or they're not entering our herd doesn't mean that we should not be setting these animals up for success. It comes down to treating every calf like we want the best for them. And I think that providing colostrum to that calf, whether that's going to be retained in your herd or going off to another phase of production, remains an important priority that we should all be considering.
With these. This might be a kind of a general question, but with some of these lower yields in the fall and winter, do we see an increase in bricks? Like, is the quality still there, or do we see a decrease in that as well?
Yeah, so when we look at across the year's time, we traditionally see a dip in yield in our fall months starting late September, October. And again, this is very farm specific. So your herd might experience this at different times. And we start to see a rebound in yield approximately in March when we look at this at the population level. So when we put cows from a bunch of different herds into one data set, we typically see that October, November-ish. And then we start to see the rebound at the beginning of March. and will increase to our peak yield that occurs usually in June. Now, when we think about Brix percent, which is an indirect indication of colostrum quality, we kind of see the opposite. We see a bit of a dip happen in our May, June, July, but when we really look at the amount of variance that we see in Brix percent, it's very small compared to what we see in yield. So if we're just not recording and plotting our Brix percents over time, I would guess that it's very challenging to be able to see that on the farm. But we do see a slight dip in May, June, July, but it's typically less than 1% Brix, so it's very small compared to the alternative that we see in yield, which we can be talking about liters.
Yeah, and so like you're like, correct me if I'm wrong on this, but you're saying so we're seeing like the same amount of grams, I guess, of IgG in the fall and in the spring. It's just how we get there is different by the amount of volume coming from the cow.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I've ever seen data that has actually calculated the grams of IgG across the time period. To do that, we would need quite a few samples, and we would have to have both the yield and the IgG concentration. Usually when we do these types of studies, we use Brix percent because that's the data that we can get from farms unless we are submitting all the samples to get IgG concentration. I think it'd be quite interesting to look at that and ask ourselves, is it a dilution effect that we're seeing or not? But when we think about dilution, I don't think that dilution explains as much of the variance in IgG concentration as some might expect. But I think that would be an interesting thing to look at.
And do they see this variance like I'm pretty siloed here in, the Great Lakes Basin, upper Midwest type area? Like, do they see this in other parts of the US or other parts of the world? Is it the same everywhere? Or is it kind of this is a local problem?
There's literature from around the US. Texas would be probably the southernmost state, and that was actually one of the first papers that looked at it in Jersey's. There's been work coming out of Europe that has shown the same thing. So, I think we see this around the globe. I'm always interested to know as we approach the equator and some different management systems, if we would see the same effect there, or if their seasonality might be different due to the difference in climate, or they might see a different effect of heat stress. But when we talk about just the problem in general, we do see it around the world.
Yeah, so and that's what's really interesting to me, because then that kind of almost negates the nutritional factors, because cows are fed different in Texas than they are probably in the upper Midwest. Like, I think nutrient spec could be relatively the same, but the feed stuffs to get there are different. So I just find that quite intriguing.
Yeah, so when we think about it in this lens, I think that's when we start to look at our associations with metabolism and different things, and all these things that probably come into this little package where a number of factors, nutrition, metabolism, endocrine factors, environment, all start to filter in. But the interactions are challenging to date to pull apart, and obviously I still think that that's the next step to be able to understand these things.
I think that the tough aspect for you guys as researchers in this, and I think you touched on it already, is to get enough numbers to scale it. Like, this is pretty much got to come from commercial herds. Like you're not going to get good data, say, if you just did this at the Cornell dairy herd, would you?
Yeah, when we did some work in 2019, we worked with 18 commercial farms, and we were working with farms anywhere between 500 and 4,500 milking cows. We worked with them for just over a year, and so we got a sizable amount of data, ended up with just over 18,000 cows. But again, like you said, it takes very sizable numbers, especially because of the individual variability in colostrum production. So even within an individual herd that's on the same management and nutrition program, cow to cow, there's a lot of variability, even if they're calving within the same week. So you just need a lot of animal numbers in order to pull some of these associations apart, and then add in cow factors. When we did our work within one geographical region, but if you expand that to different parts of the country or different parts of the country, yeah, you just need sizable animal numbers. We're starting to see some more interest in collecting colostrum records or adding those to our dairy management softwares. However, I still don't think it's a commonly performed task to be able to take that data, either the Brix percent, the yield, or both, and add that into our dairy management softwares to track that over time. If we had those data, we could retrospectively look at a lot of things just by taking, backups from different farms and looking at the data that's available. But for the most part, we're doing this prospectively. We're setting up these systems so they get recorded. So this always takes more time when you have to wait for that time delay, collect the data, then look at it, rather than just taking data and looking at it retrospectively. So if it's something that you are interested in and something that you struggle with in the fall and the winter, if you're recording it, that's one of the only ways to actually identify when the problem is happening, and if that's overlaying with anything that has changed on the farm. Did you switch a bunk, or did you change a management strategy or something? Because otherwise we often rely on our stocked colostrum, or when does our freezer go empty, and then the problem happens. But the problem might have been happening for weeks and we just had enough stockpile to get us to a different point. So unless we're actually be able to show what the cows are producing day to day, it's quite challenging to put our finger of when did it start, and is that consistent within our herd year to year, or how long is it lasting? And when we think about year to year, we might not see the same duration or the same extent in the reduction of yield. But again, unless we have data to show these things, it's very challenging to know exactly when and how bad it was.
Yeah, and I know when dealing with clients and producers too, it's part of my questioning, I guess, or inquiring about the farm is like, how are colostrum yields and stuff like that? Because like in my role, typically you'll hear about it on one farm, and then over the next 2 or 3 weeks, you'll start to hear about it more and more and more. And I spent a lot of time behind a windshield thinking about this. So it drives me nuts at certain times of the year, right? So
Yeah, you and I both. It's a challenging time of year because, like you said, especially in your type of role when you're working with multiple farms, it's a pressing issue because we know the importance of colostrum and the stress that it can put on a different part of our farm on the calf side. So it's something that we always want to address, and we want to address it quickly. But like many of us know, it's pretty rare to be able to fix the problem overnight. So pre-planning is what we're recommending at this point, because it seems to be the only way that we can really consistently get through these struggles.
yeah, and it'd be a lot easier to pre-plan if you knew what the issue was. Now we're just like, it's a complete shotgun approach. Like, do we change our strategies a little bit in the fall compared to what maybe we would do in feeding a dry cow? Because that's my purview. That's what I'm looking at. So, but then when you have no consistent results out of it, it's hard to justify spending some extra money to maybe get a result, and not really. And from my end, like, I just don't know.
Correct. And colostrum is just one aspect of this transition period.
Yeah.
And we know the importance of colostrum, but in the grand scheme of things, we have to still preserve the next production stage for that cow and transitioning into lactation. So we still have to look at these from a greater lens, and if we're going to make changes, we don't want that to compromise the health, productivity of that lactating cow, or how that cow's transitioning, etc., which, right off the bat takes some things that we might consider trying out. You already mentioned lighting, but different dietary factors, or how we're managing that dry cow. We don't want to compromise her just to try to gain an extra quarter liter of colostrum.
Yeah, and like, to that point, like, on average, how much would, say, I'm gonna exclude heifers in this, but like a parity one or parity two, parity three, like a more mature cow, like, what can producers expect for yield on average? Like, are we trying to go from 4.5 kilos of first milking to 5 kilos? Like, what's the scope here?
So when we talk about parity, our parity 2 cows are going to be our highest producers. So we kind of see our parity 1 animals, and then they increase to parity 2, and then they actually start to go down in their colostrum yield. We can expect, obviously, it's always dependent on the time of the year, and individual herd still has a lot to do with the supply of colostrum. But, if we can get 5, 6 liters, kilos out of our multi-pairs cows on average, I think we're doing well, and that fits nice into a management system, because if we're feeding 4 liters or 3.5 liters at first feeding, we still have available colostrum supply to feed in a second meal, whether we're offering 2.5, 3 liters, or whatever we plan to be doing. But that gives us enough supply. But there is still a sizable proportion of cows and multi-pairs cows too that don't hit that 6 liter mark. And if we're feeding a 4 and 2 first and second meal size, then we're still short on colostrum at the population level. So yeah, that 5 to 6 liters, depending on your time of year and in your feeding system, can be are most definitely achievable metrics.
Yeah. And I know that, just to kind of go back to why this frustrates me, is like you could talk to producers and you could have cows that are, they look like they're bursting at the seams and they don't get any yield. And you get cows that, hardly look bagged up, like from an anecdotal thought from a producer, and they don't give any colostrum. And then all of a sudden, by day 2, but day 3, these animals are steaming up and doing well. It's just so funny to me.
Yeah, it's guessing probably is never a good idea, because I think most of us know that when we're trying to guess how much colostrum we're going to get based on how that cow looks, we're usually wrong. Yeah, so
Yeah.
control your procedures and try to manage your way through the hard times. But I think that during our summer months, especially, if we have available colostrum, we can store that.
Yeah. Uh, I'm going to shift gears a little bit here. And in kind of your grand scheme of things, what should producers be doing now with either cows that are drying up or in the dry period to kind of mitigate heat stress? Because I know that's kind of the next thing that's going to rear its ugly head in production animals. So
Yeah, so we're recording this. We're approaching May now, so obviously the warmer temperatures in this part of the world are getting close to us. So obviously, if we do have heat mitigation strategies in place in our dry cow facilities, I think it's time to start looking at those again. You get on more farms than I do. I'm sure warmer days, or even next week here in upstate New York, we'll probably have some fans going. So making sure those fans are in good working condition, and just making sure that all of our cow comfort, stalls are still in good shape, and everything that is going to allow those cows and our facilities to help us keep those cows cool as we get into this time of year.
yeah, I'm almost at the point like that is your most important group of cows. And it used to be, 15, 20 years ago, nobody cared about the dry cows. But I think with the work you're doing and some of the other people in academia, like we know so much more about how important this time frame is to set up a successful lactation. But still, on the primary producer side, it's still kind of an uphill battle sometimes when we get talking about heat mitigation for the dry cows.
Yeah, so when we traditionally look, our dry cows were probably not always housed in the same facilities as our lactating cows, and it takes a while to be able to, add new facilities or move things around to be able to offer the same sort of facility for our entire herd, including our dry cows. And there's a cost associated with these things, so we can't expect to make these changes overnight. But as you said, I think that as we're learning about this transition cow and the things that happen from dry off to calving, and then as we get into lactation, I think there is opportunity there to, look at heat mitigation, cow comfort, the diet, how long that dry period is, and preserve that from the time that cow gets dried off through calving. And then obviously the first couple weeks of lactation, as we know, are very pivotal to that animal. And if we can consistently look at these things as a whole transition from dry off calving into our peak lactation pens, I would hope that the benefits that are there, we can hopefully eventually tie some numbers to be able to help us on farm implement some of these strategies.
Yeah, and you're right, like infrastructure isn't cheap. And it's not done overnight either. So I know there's things that we have to do in the short term that maybe impede progress, but in the long run, I think a lot of producers are thinking they're not thinking about next week or next month. They're thinking, long term, 5, 10, 15 years down the road, like what's this operation look like what's our bottlenecks and where do we need to go? So
Yeah, and these conversations are always good to have, especially for goal oriented or future looking. If we're not happy with the dry cow facilities or whatever that might be on our herd, we can have these conversations now and just keep learning and thinking about these things. So when we are approached with the opportunity or our business is in the right situation to be able to make an improvement in that area, we've thought about some of these things and we know what our next task might be. And I know that most producers are very good at that already. But just continuing to have these conversations with our advisors, fellow dairy producers, can help us, make that decision and find the successes that others have already experienced from these.
mhm. uh, the other kind of question I had around this is stocking density. What are your thoughts on that stocking density in the dry cow? Because I have my own ideas and biases. I'm interested in what you think.
Yeah, so when it comes to stocking density, again, it always comes back into what sort of facility are we in and how well can we manage through, especially when we talk about that close up, that fresh cow pen. Obviously, it'd be great if we could all be maintaining it 100% or less, even maybe closer to 90 or 80%, making sure that that cow has plenty of water space, plenty of bed space, plenty of bunk space. But we know that that's not always possible. So I think the question always is if we have a facility that we're using and we want to manage our stocking density, we have to overlay that with our nutritional strategy and think about if we want to reduce our stocking density, we usually have to reduce the days in our close-up pen. So I think that conversation needs to be had with your advisors, with in mind the nutritional strategy that you have, what's going into that diet, what are our goals going into the fresh period, and if we reduce the number of days in that close-up pen, recognizing that there's variability in our calving date, do the benefits of having a lower stocking density still allow us to get the benefit of that diet or not have troubles as we transition in? So I think it really is farm specific on that, and there's conversations that can be had there, and probably it's going to be a reward risk ratio and finding that optimum spot for your farm.
I know, and kind of what I was getting at is like every time that I've done it on enough farms now, you could take their projected calvings or the amount of calvings they had per month and lay their metabolic disorders with that number. And it's kind of funny because every time it just follows it, the more calvings that they have, the more metabolic issues that they have. And I think we can we can prevent a lot of disease by simply having enough space for the close-up cows, especially.
Yeah, I think it's an important aspect. If we think about a cow in that last couple of weeks of pregnancy, it's so important to maintain intake and allow her to finish growing that calf, obviously, but then also prepare herself for lactation. And then I think right on the flip side of that transition, that pen that cow goes in after calving is just as important to set her up for the rest of her lactation. And I agree that stocking density cow comfort is really important. But again, a lot of these systems we're working in fixed facilities, and we just have to really be adaptable to how we're managing through that time of year, especially if we have, a couple weeks there, like you said, where we have more calvings. What can we do to get through that?
Yeah, because it's the least static group on the farm. Like there's always cows. I know producers do a good job of maybe only doing, pen moves and things like that into the dry cow, like the close-up dry cow once a week and things like that. But the fresh cow pen is always, you're moving cows in and out every day. And I think it's about the toughest one to get a really great handle on and make sure that you have enough space for on the farm, because then it's almost like the producer's got to decide who's the most fit to move out of that group. And then, maybe you want to keep it at, a 50-day group or 60-day group, but we get into certain times of year where they have more calvings, maybe that gets shortened up to 40 days or 30 days just because of space.
It's always an interesting and something that I think about a bit, and I'm not sure that I tie a lot of, or I read about it and I think about just even the social hierarchy within some of these pens when you're constantly introducing new animals. These animals are in varying health statuses, or they had varying levels of difficulty with calving, etc. And we try to fit a lot of the times these programs into, we move a cow once a week, and at this many days in milk or this many days pre-calving, she's going to go this pen to this pen. But the reality is, when we look at a population, there's variance in all of these things, and how long cows maybe you would define as the optimum point in time. So going into the decision making of when these cows should be moving or will be moving to pens, you start to overlay the facilities. What is our nutritional approach? How many days do we want that cow on that first diet? But then there's also just a social hierarchy that's involved, especially for our smaller, timider first lactation animals when they come in. And all these things go into how much time that cow gets at the bunk. Does that cow get to lay, or does our type budget get interrupted by a different cow in the pen? And all of these things go into the success of that cow.
Yeah, there's not one or two factors involved. There's often, a dozen factors involved. And it's just it's fun some days just trying to help producers manage around that. So I wanted to talk a little bit. I heard you speak at Cornell this past fall, and you were talking about metabolizable protein numbers and dry cows and fresh cows, and kind of where the optimum levels will. I was wondering if you could share maybe some of that with us.
Yeah, that's a study that we're really excited about, and I'm still working through some of the data and continuing to learn from the data set we had. But yeah, like you said, we presented some of it at Cornell Nutrition Conference last year, and we're going to continue working on this data set, try to get these published, and continue to communicate these results, because I think that they're very interesting. I think they're helping us learn about the opportunity that exists in the transition period. So maybe what I'll do is just set up what we did here, and then maybe we can touch on a few results and maybe get some of your input about what you guys are doing in the field as well.
Yeah. So is this what your dissertation is on for your PhD?
My dissertation is actually on the epidemiology of colostrum production.
Okay. Yeah.
But we did look at colostrum production in this study, looking at different levels of MP fed prepartum. So it does tie into my dissertation research, but then a lot of the other production data will not be in my dissertation, but a data set that has been extremely fun to work through, and we're
It's
excited
just
to get out there.
interesting.
Yeah, it's super fun. So what we did was we fed 2 levels of metabolizable protein prepartum and 2 levels of metabolizable protein postpartum. And when I say prepartum, we started these cows at 28 days before expected calving, and they were fed just under 1,200 grams of MP per day, or 1,600 grams per day. And those 2 diets were balanced, so they supplied the same amount of methionine and lysine per mcal of Me. Once those cows calved, they were further split into 2 levels of MP, fed from 1 to 21 days in milk. And those were just over 2,000 grams per day, or we increased that to 2,700 grams per day. And again, those 2 postpartum diets were formulated so the methionine and lysine supply were matched during the postpartum period. So when we put those 4 diets together, we have 4 treatments where we have an animal that was fed, we'll call it a control, so at 1,200 grams prepartum, and then just over 2,000 postpartum. A high control that was fed 1,600 grams prepartum, but then was fed just over 2,000 grams postpartum. And then a control high, those animals were fed the control diet, so just under 1,200 grams prepartum, and then they were fed the higher postpartum at 2,700 grams per day. And then the high, obviously, were fed high protein prepartum and high protein postpartum. So we're kind of simulating what should we feed prepartum, what should we feed in that immediate postpartum period? And then at 22 days in milk, these cows come back together and they were all fed a common lactation diet, and we followed them until 42 days in milk. So there's been a fair bit of research that has looked at different MP supplies, either prepartum, postpartum, or if they were fed a higher prepartum diet, they were also fed a higher postpartum diet in terms of MP. But to our knowledge, there's no literature that has looked at this combination of feeding different levels pre and postpartum, and also considering the methionine and lysine supply, because we know that the importance of methionine and lysine, not in just this stage of production, but as we go through, these two amino acids are very important. So we're very interested in recognizing that those two amino acids are important and looking at a total supply of ME, or excuse me, of MP, recognizing that we're asking the question of what does a total MP supply do for these animals. So does that make sense in terms of the setup?
Yeah. Yeah. So you did control, high, high.
Correct.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
so how does that fit into what you guys are seeing in the field in terms of grams of MP around the transition period?
We're probably more, I would say in general, around that probably control or control high.
Yeah, I would say
I wouldn't say we're pushing the limits on the high in the close up. Like I think like if we're getting to that 1200 grams, then we're usually pretty satisfied with it from a farm level.
I would say that's typically what we're seeing as well. And just to give us an idea, when we model these diets for our nutritionists out there, in the prepartum diet, that's going to be pushing the control diet is going to be right around 100% of MP requirements, and that's on a CNCPS backed model. So AMTS,
That's on
NDS.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
So that control diet is going to be right around 100% of the requirement for the cows that we had in our study. So we went from control and we further bumped that above.
So you'd be going to like 130-ish%?
Yeah, between 130
Okay.
and 140%. Yeah.
Yeah.
So we're obviously very interested in the production data, but a number of other factors. But maybe we'll just start at calving. So colostrum was not affected by MP supply. We looked at yield, IgG concentration, Brix percent, the components. We did find an interaction between parity and MP supply, that cows that were entering their second lactation that were fed an elevated MP supply had a greater colostrum yield compared to the cows that were fed the control, but the animals entering the third or greater parity were not affected by MP supply. So an interesting interaction between parity and MP supply there, but we just talked at length about the challenges associated with colostrum production and changing colostrum production. So it's an interesting finding for us at this point in time, but for me to believe that that's a consistent response, I would need to see it be replicated. And we did not include any nulliparous heifers into this study. So additional work that looks at the MP supply, including heifers into these studies, might give us a better indication whether that interaction is true. If we could have, first parity, second parity, third parity, etc., animals in the same study, might give us a better indication if that would hold true. However, when we get to the milk production, we saw very interesting responses. So first off, dry matter intake was not affected pre or postpartum by diet. So increasing the MP supply did not change the intake of those cows. And then we looked at milk production in terms of the first 3 weeks of lactation while those cows were still on their fresh diet. And then we looked at their carryover phase while all the groups came back together on the same diet. And we looked at that from 22 to 42 days in milk. So we saw a nice response in milk yield, specifically for those animals that were fed an elevated MP supply during the postpartum period. So I'll just share the milk that we got out of these cows. So the cows that were fed the control produced 46 kilos of energy corrected milk, and the cows that were fed the high control produced 45 kilos of energy corrected milk in the first 3 weeks of lactation. And then we get a nice jump to our cows that were fed the control prepartum and the high postpartum. to 50.3 kilos per day, and an additional jump for those cows that were fed the high prepartum and high postpartum to 53.6 kilos per day. So we're talking 5 to 7.5 kilos of milk, depending on the comparison groups that we're going to be using here. So that really tells us that there's opportunity, especially during the first couple weeks after calving, that nutrient supply can really affect the production that these cows are giving. And when we think about that, it makes sense because of the priority of the cow, especially in the immediate weeks after calving. But interestingly, we observed a parity by treatment interaction, that the cows that were fed the high prepartum, high postpartum diet had an elevated milk yield at week 1 compared to the other 3 treatments. So by offering those cows high protein or metabolizable protein supply during pre and postpartum, we started them out a bit elevated in their milk production. But by week 2, the cows that were offered the control high caught up to those cows that were fed high, and through the remainder of the 6 weeks, they ran together. So when we think about splitting these 2 strategies apart, we need to ask ourselves if we're going to get enough benefit from providing that cow additional protein prepartum in the first week of lactation in terms of the elevated milk production. So just generally, when we talk about it over the first 3 weeks, we get a 3.3 kilo response over 21 days by offering that cow high metabolizable protein pre and postpartum. So depending on the economic situation, cost of the feedstuffs, and the price of milk, there probably is opportunity there economically to provide protein pre and postpartum. And when we ran the study, and we did this in 2021, so obviously a bit different feed and milk prices than what we're seeing today, there was a benefit economically to feeding that high diet. So we fed those cows till 21 days in milk, and then, like I said, we collapsed those cows into the same diet. So we're really trying to simulate having a fresh pen and then moving that cow on at 22 days in milk to a normal lactation diet. And for that diet, we just fed what our research herd was feeding. Interestingly though, we observed that those cows that were fed the high protein postpartum, so those 2 treatments that had elevated milk production in the first 3 weeks in milk, we retained that. And we're still getting a 4 to 5 kilo difference in milk yield that persisted through the next 3 weeks of lactation. So it's giving us an indication that we're altering that cow's ability to produce milk during that first 3 weeks of lactation. And when we put those animals back onto that common diet, we're not seeing that collapse in that next week. And then we run those 4 treatments together, but we still have a nice difference in milk production, and we're very excited to see that. And obviously you always wish you would have followed these cows further into lactation so we can know how long that lasts. But it's an exciting data set, and we're pleased with the responses we're getting. And obviously we ask ourselves a lot of new questions based off of these data, but we're excited with what we have so far.
With the ones that you fed the higher protein and then followed them through, like, so what you're saying is by 6 weeks they caught up, and you don't have any information past the first 6 weeks, could you assume, just because the trajectory of their peak, that their lactation curve would carry through lactation with that increase?
Yeah, I think that's something that we ask ourselves quite a bit. By 6 weeks in milk, we're approaching peak. So we're getting pretty close. So I'm pretty confident that those cows that were fed either the control high or the high treatment, and it gets a bit confusing since we have 4 treatments, but for the sake of milk, we really split by our postpartum protein supply. So those animals that were fed elevated protein postpartum, I would assume that they're going to peak higher since we're already approaching peak. When we look at a whole lactation curve, the question then is, do those cows have a difference in their persistency? If the persistency between these 4 treatments would remain the same, then our total lactation curve would obviously just be elevated, and we would get a larger total milk. But unless we follow those cows through an entire lactation, it's hard to say whether the extent of what we peak, if we can retain that 4 to 5 kilos at our peak, and then if our persistency or our decay in that lactation curve is the same between treatments.
That's super interesting.
We're very excited about it. And, some of the common questions you always you always ask yourself is first of all, well, how are they doing this? Obviously, milk production in the first 3 weeks is already a point in time where these animals are in negative nutrient balance. They're mobilizing adipose tissue, they're mobilizing muscle tissue. So the metabolism or the metabolic adaptation to lactation is something that we were obviously interested in looking at. Asking ourselves is, are these cows going to mobilize more body weight? Are they losing more body weight? Are they having elevated ketones, fatty acids, to be able to support these sizable differences in milk production that we're seeing through 42 days in milk? So when we look at body weight, we're getting pretty minor differences in body weight loss. When we look at the loss of body weight through the first 3 weeks in milk. And then when we look at metabolic indicators, specifically fatty acids, we have no difference in our circulating fatty acids between the 4 treatments during the first 3 weeks in milk. And that's very reflective of the loss of body condition score. So the loss of body condition score did not differ between the 4 treatments. And we also used ultrasound to measure back fat thickness, so we could monitor back fat thickness in addition to visual body condition score. And all 3 of these metrics align that circulating fatty acids, body condition score, as well as the mobilization of back fat thickness that we're determining by ultrasound were not affected by treatment, which is good to see that we're not mobilizing an excess amount of body fat in order to sustain the level of milk production that we're getting.
So when you're increasing these nutrients, they're just putting it straight to the bulk tank. It's not like you're artificially making them work harder than they genetically could. You're just expressing better it's like taking a Lamborghini and putting 87 octane in it versus high test fuel, right? Like we're just feeding these animals better and they're putting it back into the bulk tank.
Correct. Yeah. And when we think about what amino acid can do for these cows, obviously protein synthesis is going to be a large portion of what these amino acids are going to. But then it really comes down to, what does that cow need of that amino acid? If she is short on energy, she really has a couple different ways that she can go about it. So if she's short on glucose, which is our precursor to lactose, we need lactose to produce more milk. That cow can either mobilize adipose tissue to gain additional energy that way. She can also use that amino acid and divert that towards energy. So these amino acids are probably being used in a number of different ways, and we get an indication of that because we're measuring elevated plasma urea nitrogen in these animals during the first 3 weeks in milk. When those cows are producing more milk, that's telling us that some of those amino acids are being broke down for other functions in order to preserve some of the energy to go towards lactose production. However, we're still not running crazy high milk urea nitrogen values, and that's obviously an easier indication when we talk about on-farm value, because we can get those when we ship milk. And all 4 of our treatments during the first 21 days in milk have MUN values under 10 milligrams per deciliter, which is telling us that we're not overfeeding protein. It's just that these cows are using the amino acid supply that we're offering them and obviously putting it towards productive functions. But when we think about the formulation of these diets, we also have to remember that these diets were formulated such that the methionine and lysine were matched. So this is telling us that this is a total amino acid supply or a total metabolizable energy effect, rather than an increased supply of simply just methionine and lysine, which really doesn't challenge, but it adds to the benefit that we see when we feed protein. And helps us remember that the amino acid supply, but also the total metabolizable protein supply, but then also the amino acids that make up that supply are important.
So when you increase the metabolizable protein, did you do it through, like, what were your protein sources? I guess, were you doing it through like a rumen available or a rumen undegradable protein source, or was it a combination? Or
yeah, so when we formulate these diets, we tried to be intentional about keeping the same products and just manipulating the amount of products that. So each of the diets had canola meal, soybean meal, soy plus, so a heat treated soybean meal, and
Yep.
then also we had blood meal coming in. So the cows that had an elevated MP supply obviously would have had more of the heat treated soybean meal and more of the blood meal coming in than the cows that were fed the control diet. Then we used commercially available rumen protectin, methionine, and lysine to come back into our control diets to be able to bring those diets up to the same concentration of methionine and lysine as those cows that were receiving the high diet. So for the most part, we're feeding diets, especially in the postpartum period. Our diets had the same amount of rumen degradable protein. So the elevated protein that was coming in as a rumen undegradable protein source.
So that's probably why you weren't seeing increases in MUNs, because it was getting utilized better than maybe
So
inefficiently. Yeah.
correct. So that helps us in our interpretation of our data because the elevated MUN or PUN that we do see, we can tie back to its breakdown in the liver rather than breakdown in the rumen, since we did have those diets matched on rumen degradable protein. So we're really allowing that cow to take those amino acids, then she's going to be allowed to do with them as she pleases, rather than degradation in the rumen and absorption of ammonia, and that's in that fashion.
You're making me think here, which is good. I like when I listened to you at Cornell, like it made me think, right?
Yeah, I think and obviously there's years of thinking or months of thinking in these data sets, but I think there is practical application to these, especially if you're structured, your farm is structured, or your client is structured in a way that you can manipulate that early postpartum diet. And there's probably opportunity even in automatic milking systems because they have capabilities to precision feed animals. So there's widespread application of these data, but I think more than anything, it excites me because it reminds us the potential that we have during this transition period to affect this cow and how long this can carry out. And we know that protein sources are an expensive component of the diet, but when we're talking about the sizes, the effect sizes of milk that we're getting, 5 kilos carrying over, there's opportunity to do this in an economically sound way as well.
Yeah, and I know like if you're getting that much return early, the extra protein sources that you'd have to add there, like you're just going to get such a good ROI on it that it makes a lot of sense to really reconsider what you're doing with the fresh cow groups, and especially too with in an AMS setup, like we can completely target feed those animals and
Correct.
have that last through an entire lactation, right? So
Correct. Yes. So I think that's really what one of the benefits of this research is we are, so to say, precision feeding these animals, that we're really focusing the additional cost associated with this diet on a very specific point in time. We're targeting 4 weeks before calving, 3 weeks after calving, and then putting that cow onto the next diet. Although with the opportunity that we're seeing, or the response that we're seeing here, starting to string some of these things together, looking at, and maybe we should be starting all the way back at the far off diet, considering the diet and how these diets connect. And do we take that animal that was on a high diet postpartum or was fed an elevated MP supply, and are we pulling nutrients away from her too fast on that next diet? And is that, going to inhibit her? Or,
or even
what is the
undersupplying.
correct?
You
What is
know,
the
if you go,
next step that we need to take? Because when we switch these diets at 3 weeks in milk, these animals are not in a positive nutrient balance. So we have to remember that we can't just completely pull the nutrients from them or go back to just, what we would typically be feeding, recognizing that they're still in a vulnerable state because they're still mobilizing tissue to support production.
well, you're really making me think about this. And I know a colleague of mine says sometimes when we're dealing with these ration balancing programs, we got to realize we're dealing with Lamborghinis, not Ford Fiestas, because
Yeah,
there's just like the genetics and management on farms now. Like I don't know where the next level is. We've got herds that are doing 7.5, 7 kilos of components now on a regular basis. And it's like, it takes a lot of nutrients to get in there. And it's these little things that we tweak now, even if you're looking at a 3-week period and getting that kind of milk response and it carries through the lactation, like that's dollars and cents in a producer's pocket, right? So
Correct. Yeah. These cows they're pretty incredible, and I'm not sure that we do know the upper limit of them, and we're going to continue to learn over the years to come as we get better and we think differently, what we can do as managers, nutritionists, consultants, producers, etc., to really harness the potential.
yeah, I think that's an excellent place to jump off, Trent. I know we're on a little bit of a time crunch for you here, and I just want to be respectful of that. And I truly appreciate you coming on the podcast today and sharing your expertise and what you guys have been working on at Cornell with the listeners today.
Yeah, I appreciate the invitation, and it's been a fun conversation.
Thanks, Trent. Thanks for listening. This episode of the Dairy Farmers Digest is brought to you by the dairy team at Waldstein Feed and Supply Limited. If you enjoyed the show, subscribe and follow us on your favorite podcast player, and please leave us a review. If you would like further information about today's topic, check out the show notes for further details and our contact information. I would also like to extend special thanks to Christine Schoonerwood, our producer, and our sound engineer, Daniel Noguera.